Let me say it's a pleasure to be here. I think what you all do in classrooms is quite extraordinary. You get the students that are the late bloomers. You get the students who are economically distressed. You get what we call non-traditional students who are juggling family and work and are more than distracted. And it's your job to try to give them a spark, to touch them, to reach their imagination, to get them to be more curious than they would otherwise be, to make them see beyond simply the degree they might get, the better shot they'd have to get ahead in their occupation, and to have a little sense of what their job is as a citizen and what their capacity is, what their potential is as a person of curiosity and imagination. And you do that, as Jean indicated, with colleges that are getting budget cuts, we heard from Dr. King earlier about 3 years of salary freezes and furloughs. You do it you're really on the front lines. And so I want to say I'm pleased to be here, and I really want to pay tribute to you all. Now, I'm asked to talk about America's economic future. And I should warn you about my credentials in doing this. First of all, I'm famous for having predicted about 7 of the last 3 recessions. So don't use any of my advice on investment plans of yours. Secondly, I am part of what Ronald Reagan said were the most dangerous words in America. I'm from Washington, and I'm here to help. This is not just a conservative position. Jim Hightower, the great populist, warns that Washington has a lot of 5-watt light bulbs situated in 100-watt sockets. And so you should understand Washington has a very different perspective than the rest of the world. That beltway around the city has turned into sort of a wizard's moat these times. And let me give you some examples of that. In Washington, housing prices are going up. It is the only city in America where housing prices are going up. In Washington, jobs are plentiful because we have a divided government. Both former Republican legislators and staffers and former Democratic legislators and staffers are all in demand as lobbyists. And so it's salad days for Washington in terms of employment. In Washington, we just had a bipartisan agreement to extend tax cuts on the very wealthiest Americans. And we are about to have a bipartisan agreement to cut spending, including spending on education, across the board. In the rest of the country, the priorities are just the reverse. Poll after poll shows Americans would rather raise taxes on millionaires and protect spending on education. So Washington is a very different place than the rest of the country. When I wanted to turn to the subject about, okay, well, how do we think about America's future? I started looking at economic numbers and charts, and I thought, we'd be wise not to go back to the economic gurus who couldn't see the housing bubble before it burst, and we'd be wise not to consult Goldman Sachs's crystalline computerized algorithms because they seem to not take into the question of the real world. I thought the best advice we could get was from that great scholar and sage Yogi Berra, who when asked said, "The future ain't what it used to be." Exactly. The future ain't what it used to be. And today I want to expound on that a little bit. I want to talk about what went into this economic collapse we are still experiencing, review the effort to try to build a new foundation out of its ruins, the frustration of that effort, and where we go from here. The better title of the speech might be The Return of the Zombies or The Empire Strikes Back or something like that. So let's start. For most Americans, as you know, the Great Recession is still going on. 25 million people are in need of full-time work. Gas prices are rising, home values are still sinking. It is now predicted that by the end of the year, 40% of American homes with a mortgage will be underwater, will be worth less than their mortgage, 40%. Americans, not surprisingly, have a hard time seeing a recovery that economists have declared has officially begun. Americans aren't worried about a double-dip recession because they don't think we're out of the first dip yet. That Great Recession, the worst since the Great Depression, was founded on and was caused by significantly three huge imbalances. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Imbalances that were unsustainable and contributed directly to the collapse. First, the concentration of income and wealth. By 2007, on the verge of the collapse, we had income inequality that we had not seen since 1929 on the verge of the Great Depression. The top 1% of Americans were capturing 25% of all income, about twice as much as the bottom 50%. They controlled as much wealth as the bottom 90% of Americans. That kind of inequality meant that they were capturing literally all of the rewards of growth. From 2002 to 2007 in the Bush recovery, it was the first recovery since World War II where median households lost ground. They lost about $1,000 in household income while the economy was growing, while profits were rising, while productivity was increasing. The result of that is that middle-class families had to struggle to stay afloat. More people went to work, they took more jobs, they mortgaged their homes, they borrowed money to send their kids to college, they went into debt, they ran up credit card bills, and with that instability, more families hit the wall more often. There's a stunning index of economic insecurity that I recommend to you that Jacob Hacker did with the Rockefeller Foundation. They decided to measure economic insecurity by a family that would take the hit of 25% of their income in any one year because of either loss of a job or out-of-pocket medical expenses, and didn't have the savings to cover that. So how many families of that are at risk of that every year in America? 1 of 5. A staggering figure, but a figure that is about the kinds of insecurities that people are dealing with. If you take that hit and you don't have those kinds of savings, it takes you about 6 to 8 years to recover. So that's what's happening in the time when the economy was growing before the collapse. Even Alan Greenspan, who I consider to be the sort of arch-druid of market fundamentalism, said, and I quote, that this extreme equality is not the type of thing which a democratic society, a capitalist democratic society, can readily accept without addressing. It was literally unsustainable. The second thing, besides Gilded Age inequality, was the triumph of finance over the real economy, and very much associated with that. By 2006, the 6 biggest banks had assets that were worth a staggering 55% of the nation's GDP. They were too big to fail. They were almost too big to save. They were capturing about 40% of the nation's total profits. They had turned themselves more and more with deregulation into a casino, inventing new instruments like derivatives, which Warren Buffett called financial instruments of mass destruction. They were leveraging themselves up further and further, marketing even synthetic home mortgages that they knew would fail. Charles Prince, the hapless CEO of Citibank, said, as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance, and we are still dancing. He said that after the collapse of Bear Stearns, when the housing bubble had already begun to burst. He was gone 2 months later, and Citibank would have been would have gone bankrupt except for the federal government bailout. So Gilded Age inequality, the triumph of casino finance, and then massive and unsustainable trade imbalances. By the time of the Great Recession, America was borrowing $2 billion abroad to cover its trade deficits. We were shipping good jobs abroad and not goods abroad. Andy Grove, the legendary head and CEO of Intel, one of America's great corporations, looked around in about 2007 at Silicon Valley, and he realized there were fewer workers engaged in production in Silicon Valley then than there were when he made the first prototype for the Apple computer. And now Intel was moving its most advanced research labs and capacities to where its production lines were, which were in China. We are now running a high technology trade deficit with China. These global trade imbalances, as both the International Monetary Fund and Ben Bernanke of the Federal Reserve concluded, were simply unsustainable. And they contributed directly to the sloshing of money that went through the financial system and built up the bubble that finally burst. They had to be changed. Now, many people would add a fourth factor to this conjury that led into the Great Depression, and that is the fact that America, since the end of the Cold War, and possibly because the end of the Cold War, has continually been engaged in intervention and wars across the world. We now spend more in real dollars than we spent at the height of our Cold War spending on the military. We spend almost as much as the rest of the world combined spends on its militaries. We are now we were fighting 2 wars at the beginning of the Great Depression in the Middle East, now 3. We maintain an empire of bases numbering over 700 in over 100 countries and are permanently engaged. We patrol the 7 seas. We are permanently engaged in covert operations and in skirmishes across the world. The result of that in distraction of resources, in the development of a military-industrial complex of great political power, and in the distraction of attention is increasingly costly in a country that hasn't made the investments it needs to make at home. If you then take those 3 fundamental factors, these 3 imbalances, the fourth being the military, then anybody coming to America sees the problems that were not being addressed that essentially were pressing on the nation's attention. Global warming, which the military describes as more destabilizing across the world than Al-Qaeda. The public investment deficit, an infrastructure that this building is a wonderful, this used to be a post office. This used to be a public building, but this is an infrastructure, whether it's sewers or bridges or trains or mass transit, that we have failed to invest in, that we've been living off the old investments, and now is decrepit and increasingly dangerous to lives, and certainly costly to the economy. A healthcare system that is simply broken. We have a healthcare system that costs twice as much per capita as any other industrialized country's healthcare system and provides worse results. 40 million people without healthcare. Seniors who 2 retired seniors who, at the age of 65, who have Medicare will face paying $200,000 in out-of-pocket medical costs for the remaining years of their lives under the best public health system we have. Our healthcare system costs are skyrocketing, and they will bankrupt everything if they are not brought under control. Families, businesses, state governments, and the national government. The entire projection, all those scary projections you see about America's long-term debt crisis, it is entirely the increase in soaring healthcare costs. If we paid as much as the Europeans do per capita for the most high advanced system that they have there, we would have literally no long-term debt crisis whatsoever. It removes it completely. You either get healthcare costs under control and solve the debt crisis, or you don't get them under control and it will bankrupt everything. Okay, so how did all this happen? Obviously, there's a huge argument about that, but it seems to me it's pretty inescapable that we went through a 30-year period in which conservative ideas and conservative movements were dominant. We had a 30-year experiment with market fundamentalism. It started not really with Reagan, it started in late Jimmy Carter. And it went through, it wasn't just a Republican or a conservative thing. Democrats adopted it, New Democrats adopted it, became a bipartisan consensus, whether it was corporate trade, deregulation of finance, ignoring the assault on unions, encouraging companies to pay CEOs with short-term bonuses that skewed the system, privatization, soaring inequality. All of those were bipartisan products of a 30-year period embraced by Democratic and conservative and Republican administrations combined. Then came the calamity. And the costs of those ideas, one would have thought those ideas themselves became clear and hopefully discredited. So we had the election in 2008, the Hope and Change election. It was an extraordinary election. I don't know how many of you got involved in it, but it was a time of Americans rousing themselves. Who would have thought that we would have elected a man named Barack Hussein Obama to be president of the United States, who no one really knew when he started to run, a freshman senator from Illinois who understood more than anyone what was moving in the society, that people were hungry and anxious for change. So, a severe crisis, conservative ideas discredited, a president elected with majority vote with a mandate for change, Democrats with 60 votes in the Senate, with a strong Speaker of the House and a formidable majority with Nancy Pelosi. America was poised to make the changes desperately needed and called for by the crisis. Now, needless to say, Obama inherited the ruins: 2 wars, $1 trillion deficit, an economy in free fall, losing 400,000 jobs a day, global recession. There was a famous Onion newspaper headline: "Black guy gets worst job in America," right? It could have sort of captured that moment. And Obama understood the scope of the challenge. This was his remarkable feature as a politician, to me. I thought Obama was sort of in the Clinton mode, that he would be a kind of new Democrat, cautious, moderate politician. But he understood the challenges we face. He gave a remarkable speech, which I recommend to you, in Georgetown in April of 2009, his economic sermon on the Mount, in which he said, we can't recover to the old economy because that economy was not working for most Americans. So there is no recovery. We have to build a new foundation for this economy in the ruins of the old. We have to find a different way to grow, and that means we have to build more things here and sell more things abroad and buy less from abroad. We have to invest in areas vital to our future, like education and research and development and new energy. We have to make fundamental changes in this economy. The old economy was built on the shifting sands of bubbles and debt, and we must build a new foundation. It's an extraordinary speech of a president with a big vision. And in fact, he put large reforms before this Democratic Congress. So if you think back over the last 2 years, a recovery plan, which was the biggest recovery plan since the Great Depression. The largest in that was the largest increase in spending on the poor since the Great Society. $70 billion in investment in new energy, renewable energy. He doubled the education budget in that recovery plan. He put comprehensive health care reform before the Congress to try to assure both that most Americans would be able to have affordable health care and to get health care costs under control over the long term. He did education reform, taking the banks out of lending to students so that you could do direct lending, saving $30 billion to increase in Pell Grants, the largest increase in student assistance since the GI Bill. He put climate change reform before the Congress, cap and trade legislation, to invest in new energy, to accelerate the transition, and to make America a leader in the green industrial revolution that is sweeping the world. And he even tried to change our trade strategy. He went to the G20 in Pittsburgh, and he got a consensus around the notion that the imbalances in trade were unsustainable, with China and Germany and the other surplus countries signing on to a statement that said both surplus countries and deficit countries had to adjust. We had to build more and buy less, and sell more and buy less from abroad. They had to increase internal demand and be less dependent on export growth. Set up the IMF to monitor this change. It was a big deal, and then it was the kind of foundation for what could have been a different trade policy. Financial reform to try to get Wall Street under control, to set up a consumer financial protection agency for the first time, to police the trade in derivatives and address the problem of too big to fail. This was, at least in its subjects, the right subjects that America has to deal with. And it was audacious to put this on the table in such a short amount of time in the midst of the crisis. Now, many of us argued at the time that the conception of each of these reforms was too moderate and too limited. The recovery plan wasn't big enough. Financial reform was too timid. Healthcare was compromised preemptively. But this was a reform agenda that was worthy of a president, worthy of a people, worthy of a time. And the result was, as you know, a Donnybrook. The entrenched corporate interests that have privileges and subsidies to fend mobilized. Legions of lobbyists descended on Washington. Last year, 11,000 lobbyists were registered in Washington. $3 billion spent on direct lobbying, $500 million in direct funding of financial contributions. That doesn't count billions in AstroTurf campaigns that is not reported. 300 former legislators camp out on the House floor and the Senate floor and the House gym and the Senate gym of both parties as official lobbyists for the big corporations in America. And the corporations, whether it was big oil or finance or the health insurance companies or the drug companies or the military industrial companies, mobilized to protect the subsidies and privileges that they have from taxpayers. Republicans chose remarkably unified obstruction. No vote for the recovery plan, no vote for financial reform, no vote for, not one vote for healthcare reform. The mighty Wurlitzer of the right, from Fox News to the Wall Street Journal to Limbaugh, sounded the call of resistance. And the claims, as you know, were wild. Death panels in the healthcare bill, Kenyan socialism in the White House. Even when the Congress moved to eliminate what is a simply indefensible tax break for hedge fund operators, the supposed carried interest tax break that allows billionaire hedge fund operators to pay a lower effective income tax rate than their chauffeurs. Steve Schwarzman, a billionaire with BlackRock, said that this was the equivalent of Hitler invading Poland, and mobilized to stop the reform and succeeded in doing that. And in fact, the resistance largely succeeded. Despite the crisis, despite the mandate, despite the Democratic majorities, the Recovery Act was reduced in size. The investment and public works parts of it were cut. More of it was turned to tax cuts for the affluent and for businesses. Energy legislation was blocked. Financial reform was diluted. Healthcare reform was delayed and delayed and delayed and compromised. The drug companies were bought off. The public option was jettisoned. It is astounding to me. We have a provision in the law that prohibits Medicare from negotiating bulk prices for prescription drugs. Prohibits it. How could you even write that provision? Right? At a time when healthcare costs will bankrupt the country. And they kept that provision in the healthcare reform. On trade, the multinationals mobilized against the new trade policy, called Obama a protectionist, sounded the gun, opposed any challenge to the Chinese currencies, even as the administration was really backing off what it had started. What's the result? The result now is 2 years later, the old economy is coming back. The economy that the president said we could not return to is reasserting itself. 25 million people are still in need of full-time work, but the wealthiest Americans have rebounded. We've just had the Wall Street Journal announces the best stock market quarter since 1999. And the wealthiest 1% of America now is richer and controls more wealth than it did on the edge of the crisis. The top 1% is back earning 25% of all income. The finance industry is back. Corporate finance profits are back to 30% of all corporate profits. The top 6 banks now are bigger and more concentrated than they were before the collapse, now controlling assets worth about 63% of GDP. They may well be too big to save. The trade deficit, which plummeted to about $1 billion a day at the bottom of the recession, is now back up to $1.5 billion a day and rising. Big oil has defended its subsidies. The US is losing its chance to become a leader in the green industrial revolution. Spain, Germany, China are all investing heavily in capturing the markets for windmills and solar and photovoltaics that will, in fact, be a centerpiece of the new markets of the future. So in 2010, voters went out and punished Democrats for failing. I don't blame them, you know. Well, what was the biggest thing on voters' minds? Overwhelmingly jobs and the economy. What did Democrats fail to do? We failed to produce jobs. And we failed to have an argument that was consistent about how we were going to produce jobs. So they thought we were ignoring them and they punished us. They didn't buy the conservative agenda. Every poll shows that. But they were throwing the bums out, a sensible position. Just keep throwing them out until you find somebody who's paying attention, right? The Tea Party on the far right, part real grassroots, part millionaire, Koch brother, AstroTurf, drove the debate from the right, and conservative Republicans captured the Congress without changing a comma in the conservative mantra and ideas that drove us off the cliff. An extraordinary fact. So now in the House, you see the debate driven by the old ideas. Cut spending. If that costs jobs, quote, so be it, says Speaker of the House John Boehner. Cut taxes or extend taxes for the rich. If that increases deficit, it doesn't matter, says Grover Norquist, the conservative activist, because deficits are simply the symptom. The problem is too much spending. Rollback regulations, starting with the EPA and financial reforms. The new House Finance Committee Chair, Spencer Baucus, says Washington and regulators are there to serve the banks, quote, unquote. Repeal health care, if that increases the deficit long term, because there was a lot of deficit reduction in the health care bill on health care costs, ignore the CBO figures that are the basis for all budget projections. And then deal with rising healthcare costs on the budget, not by taking on drug companies and insurance companies and the hospital complexes that drive up our costs beyond to 2 times the European rate, but by putting a lid on Medicare and Medicaid and pushing the rising costs, which are not controlled, on those least able to afford them, seniors, the vulnerable, and the disabled. And then at both the national and the state level, a consistent attempt to take the bill for the financial collapse. The banks blew themselves up, doubled the national debt, increased deficits at the federal and state level with the recession, and now that bill is going to be sent to middle class and working families, even as they continue to try to push tax cuts on the top end. And this is combined with a systematic attempt to reduce and to weaken the opposition. That's what the attack on public employees is about, but it's not just the attack on public employees and their right to bargain. It is also stripping students of their right to vote on campuses. It is various forms of official ID that makes it harder for seniors and poor people to be qualified to vote. This is not just in Wisconsin, it is across the states controlled by Republican legislators and governors, and this is coming at us. And with this conservative reaction is a resurgence of the same ideas and their apostles that drove us off the cliff. The most vivid example of this is that Alan Greenspan has been trotted out again. Now, Greenspan, after the crisis, went before a House committee and said he was shocked to find that his ideology had a flaw in it, because he thought that markets self-regulated and they were very stable, and he was stunned that they would get something so wrong as a massive housing bubble, which he didn't see. Well, in the last 2 weeks, Alan Greenspan has come out and he has announced that Obama's government activism is getting in the way of an otherwise robust economy, and that we ought to roll back financial reform because, in Greenspan's works, with some exceptions, like 2007, financial markets regulate themselves and are remarkably stable, with some exceptions. As one wag noted, this is generally true. Nuclear power is safe, with some exceptions. Offshore oil drilling doesn't need regulation, with some exceptions. New Orleans levees and dams are stable and adequate to the task, with some exceptions. Minneapolis bridges are always sturdy, with some exceptions. Call it zombie economics. The ideas that one would have thought were already dead have come back to life even after they were exposed to the light. Now, in wake of this offensive, the president has sued for peace. He defended his health care law. He announced he would veto the first House budget that wanted to cut $60 billion, or 25% or so, out of all domestic programs, including education from Head Start to Pell Grants. But he embraced a 5-year freeze on domestic spending while leaving defense off the table. He began to champion the old trade agenda and put off efforts to challenge the mercantilism of the Chinese and the global initiative he started. He accepted the need to review regulation and began to limit the reach of financial reforms internally, cut a deal on extending tax cuts for the wealthy, tax breaks for business, in order to get a continuation of unemployment insurance. In general, has been in ideological retreat, even going across Lafayette Park to speak at the Chamber of Commerce, pretending that they were a business association as opposed to the paid lobbyists for some of the most rapacious corporations in America. So what do we make of this? I think this is a sobering and very dangerous failure of progressive governance. This was our moment. America does progressive reform in spasms. Think the New Deal, think the Great Society, think everything was set up for this. Crisis, discredited conservative ideas, mandate, Democratic majorities, and we failed. And we failed because the entrenched interests were too strong, the Democratic Party too compromised, the conceptions too weak. I think this gives enormous credibility to a conservative critique. Because the most powerful conservative critique is that big government will always be controlled by the strong. It will always create entrenched, barnacled, crony capitalism that will skew markets and rob taxpayers. And if you're not going to serve me, why don't you just give me my money back and let me try to make it on my own? It is a quite plausible position. It is reflected in the Tea Party anger about how the big banks got bailed out and nothing was done for Main Street. So this is a challenge that progressives have to be able to respond to. Now, it must be said that Tea Party or that principled conservative position is not the way Washington works. Once you pass that beltway or the moat, what the Tea Party is doing in Washington is sustaining the subsidies to big oil and cutting the attempt to create alternative energy, extending the tax cuts for the rich and cutting investment in education, rolling back Medicare and trying to put a real lid on Medicare and Medicaid. But what we face here is a bigger question. This is the way I believe great nations decline. That is, you take all of the institutions that made you great, and they become encrusted. And then you can't react to changed circumstance. It's why I think dictatorships are fragile. It is, of course, the challenge and the promise of democracy. Because democracy's promise is when the system gets so encrusted and so corrupt, the people will revolt, and they will have the capacity to revolt. And they will cast out the failed ideas. They will overturn the powerful lobbies. They will ignore the compromised politicians. They will throw the bums out. And they will create the conditions for the change that the society needs to renew itself. That's the story of America. If you look back at our history, that's really our story. That's Jefferson at the beginning of the Republic. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. This is the story of Lincoln and the abolitionists, saving the nation and getting rid of the scourge of slavery. This is the story of Roosevelt and the unions and the socialist movements and the Townsend movement and Huey Long at the time, wrenching the government, the economy out of the Depression, shackling finance so that for 50 years we didn't have a financial crisis, putting people back to work, creating Social Security and the beginnings of a safety net and a social contract in America. This is the story of the Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Movement forcing Johnson to finally get rid of the scourge of segregation. The story of the women's movement, the consumer movement, the environmental movement, the gay rights movement, all moving America out of encrusted and discredited doctrines, making America better. But now, there's no guarantee this happens. Now we've had our moment, and at this moment, the forces of the status quo, essentially, have won. And what the future is unknown. So what is America's economic future? America's economic future, I would say to you, is contested. It's going to be fought in the suites in Washington, where money and position and authority counts heavily. It's being fought right now in the streets of Wisconsin and Ohio and elsewhere, where workers are pushing back against the attempt to eliminate their right to organize. It will be fought both at the election booth, but also outside the election booth with growing citizen movements, I believe, on both the right and the left, expressing the anger of people in an economy that is not working for them, where Washington simply is oblivious to it. So I can tell you, in Washington, the president assumes that he's got enough jobs growth to be able to run on recovery for re-election. And the Republicans assume that there's enough jobs growth that they can make deep cuts in public spending and not send us back into a recession. I think they both are out of touch with what's going on around the country outside of the Beltway. So, in China, I'm told the phrase, "may you live in interesting times," is a curse. And we live in interesting times. We are entered into a great war of ideas, a great war of power, a great battle about whether America can renew itself. And the outcome is indeterminate. Winston Churchill once said that Americans always do the right thing after they have exhausted every other alternative. But there is no guarantee, of course, that we actually get to the right thing, even while we're exhausting all the alternatives. What we do know is we're blessed with a very wealthy, a very rich, a very diverse nation with an extraordinary people. We have a great history of progressive struggle and of victory and of change. We have an abiding faith in America that we still can forge our future. Although it is foreboding that now most Americans believe in polls that their children will not fare as well as they have for the first time ever in American polling. But we will decide. It's not going to be in anybody else's hands. It's going to be in the hands of you and your students and what we do or what we fail to do about what this future is going to be. And the one thing we know is this is going to be on the table. This is contested. This is not determined now. We're going to argue this not just this year and next year, but for several years as we try to find a way to rebuild an economy that works for most Americans. We're not there yet. We've just begun the argument. The struggle continues, and I look forward to waging it with you. Thank you. So, we started late. I have to worry a little bit about time, but not too much. So can we, I'd love to have questions or comments. Or.
referred to as an organized crime figure, which always has abbreviations, so it's like Louis the Henchman or something, or Joey the Fish. That would be Bubbles Greenspan.
It is strange the lack of accountability that takes place at the highest levels of American power. So in the last 2 weeks, we had Greenspan commenting on the economy, a man who did more than anyone else, really, to allow the bubble to build and to burst and to cause the travails we're in. We had Rumsfeld commenting on Obama's coalition in the invasion of Libya. Rumsfeld? I mean, please, right? We had Ollie North, bless my soul, on television saying that the president was wrong not to go to Congress to get approval for the war, which I agree with, incidentally. But Ollie North, who ran the secret war for Reagan that almost got the president impeached, or should have gotten the president impeached, why are these people consulted as experts? I mean, it is stunning that they should be doing penance in monasteries. We don't need seppuku like the Japanese do, but we at least they should get off the scene, it seems to me.
In the 60s, you spoke out against the industrial military complex. You were right.
Yeah, Eisenhower started it, if you remember. He was the one who coined the phrase and warned about its inordinate power. What's remarkable about it now, with the combination of the military and the Homeland Security, internal security complex that got built after 9/11, is that it really has displaced our civilian foreign policy. So military admirals are increasingly our ambassadors. When we want to do nation building, we send in troops, not civilians. We have almost no civilian capacity anymore. The military has displaced it all. And the problem with being permanently engaged around the world is that there's always some place to get involved. And so the core military budget is now more than half of the discretionary budget that Congress appropriates every year. But that doesn't count the costs of using the military. That's just for it being, quiescent. The wars come on top of that. And I even think the bigger cost is the distraction. Presidents then have to spend their time and attention on those wars. Obama spends a dramatic amount of his time, as does his top leadership, on Afghanistan, on getting out of Iraq, and now on Libya. And when you're doing that, you don't have time to spend on the fundamental questions you face here at home. It's a huge problem.
I'm just wondering, is there any hope in dismantling the big banks? That is maybe much of the problem really is.
Well, we fought that battle in financial reform. There was an attempt, we were part of a process to try to create a amendment that would put a lid on the size of banks. That failed. There's an effort internationally to try to force the biggest banks to keep more equity and reserves, so that it penalizes them. They can't be benefited by their size. The problem with being too big to fail is that then people are happy to give you a break on anything you borrow because they know you're backstopped. They don't worry about it. You get a better price than a small bank if you want assets, right? And so this demand that they keep more resources than a small bank would counterbalance that. That the banks are mobilizing now to frustrate. My fear is that we're going to have to go through another crisis before we get there. Jamie Dimon, before the Financial Commission, Investigative Commission, was asked, how would you define a financial crisis? And he said, I was just talking to my daughter about that. A financial crisis is just something that happens every 5 years. Now, if you're Jamie Dimon, you've just survived this financial crisis. You came out on top. You're bigger, more consolidated, more profitable. You're hailed as a genius. The rest of the country is devastated, right? 40% of homes underwater. So for him, every 5 years, if he can win each one, he's going to make more and more money and get more and more concentrated as he picks up the losers. For us, we can't stand it, but I do believe now it's going to be hard to imagine how we do it until there's another crisis.
Didn't it used to be that states, that banks could only be within a state?
They're still chartered. They're still chartered within states, but the deregulation process removed a lot of both the limits on branches, et cetera, and then the final deregulation that took place under Clinton, championed by Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan, removed the division between commercial banking and investment banking. And that was the thing that just opened the door for the real gambling. And that's still gone.
What was the rationale of opening that up?
Citibank wanted it. Citibank had just merged with Travelers Insurance, which was doing investment banking, and they wanted to become, they wanted that to be legal. It would have been illegal under Glass-Steagall. They lobbied heavily for it. Rubin argued that we had to have big banks because everything was global, and they had to operate globally, and we would have a margin of advantage. That would be America's great strength. It should be noted that Rubin then left to take a $15 million a year job as a strategic advisor to Citibank, and the Clinton administration pushed that through.
Basically about there being possibly another crisis. There's a theory, Naomi Klein has this shock doctrine theory, which kind of says that it's less a left and right issue. There's sort of a system of entrenched interests that are kind of causing all these things and profiting off of crises like our financial crisis. And it seems to me like there needs to be a bigger push towards transparency in government and figuring out what banks are influencing what politicians and stuff. There's one thing called the Sunlight Foundation. Of it. Mm-hmm. They offer a lot of great resources online if people are interested in finding out who's influencing what.
I'm proud to say that Ellen Miller, who started that, came from the Campaign for America's Future before that. The shock doctrine applies both ways. I mean, Naomi's theory was that what the right is good at is it has doctrines lying around that when the crisis takes place, they can implement that would never be accepted in normal times by the democracy. But because they can argue we need it, they can impose wage controls and not price controls. They can strip people of pensions. You see it at the state level. Let's get rid of the state pensions. Let's get rid of the right to organize. We have this budget crisis. That's a pure version of the shock doctrine. It's also, when Rahm Emanuel said we can't let a crisis go to waste, it's also should be a progressive response. That is, you have an economic crisis like that, we ought to be having ideas lying around that we can drive in that can actually address the reforms. So, but there's no question that the crisis creates the moment when both the encrusted interests want to resist change and there's the possibility of change. It could go either way.
You were bringing up Greenspan and Molly North and some other people. I think the media sort of researches these people as experts. I don't think a lot of people on a conservative, progressive, or democratic level really can give too much credit to people who have been exceptionally discredited and you're just trying to promote work for.
I hope that's right.
Kind of like G. Gordon Liddy, too.
Right, I hope that's right.
They pop up for whatever current trend. But recently there was a study, there's been studies for several years, but most effectively, three economists at Stanford that said across the board government cuts in spending, and I believe their figure is 12%, could solve this crisis in record time. And the bipartisanship seems to be the biggest impediment to that.
What's the crisis in that sentence? Solve this crisis. What crisis?
Well, the one we've been talking about, the financial crisis.
Well, cuts in spending won't put people to work. They will cost jobs. So cuts in spending arguably could help balance the budget if they didn't slow the economy.
And if they help balance the budget, that provides a lot of opportunity for some of Obama's programs and a lot of opportunity for the bickering between the two parties to be moved off the table and actually get some of this rolling and doctors' jobs and all these other.
Right. It's worth talking about this a little bit because we have this in Washington. Washington is totally fixated on the deficit crisis. And we have a lot of money going into making the deficit crisis a crisis like Naomi Klein's that is so overwhelming that we must deal with it now. And there are three or four things that are clear about this. One is the best way to reduce the deficit is to put people to work. That is to get them off unemployment insurance and food stamps and Medicaid and on paychecks, paying taxes, and buying things. And so if you don't put people to work, every deficit reduction program, whether it's the Republican or conservative, or assumes that we're going to have growth. And the growth on its own cuts the deficit down to from 8%, 6%, 10% of GDP, depending on what year we are, down to 5% of GDP, cuts it in half. Nothing else comes close to having that effect. And so the question is that Washington has to answer: do deep cuts in spending now to balance the budget or to move the budget in balance cost jobs or create jobs? The Keynesian argument is interest rates are at 0 and can't go much lower from the Fed. There is inadequate demand. Companies are sitting on profits and not investing because they don't have consumers. States and localities are cutting back. Consumers are tightening their belts. Their homes are going down in value. They've got to pay down and rebuild their savings. The only thing that's going to drive this economy is government spending. And if you cut government spending, if you cut deficits now, most liberal Keynesians would argue you got to increase deficits now. If you cut it now, you'll cost jobs and the economy won't replace them. The Republican position is cut and grow. That if you cut jobs now, cut spending and cut jobs, which they admit it will cut public jobs, it will increase confidence of consumers and you and us and businesses that they won't face future tax cuts. And therefore, they will be more ready to hire now or to spend now. Now, I don't believe that consumers are mostly not spending because they're worried about future tax cuts. I believe they're not spending because they just lost a ton of money. And I don't believe that businesses aren't hiring because they worry about future tax increases. They are not hiring because they don't have any customers. And so I think that argument is wrong, but that's the argument we're having now in Washington. So if you assume growth and cut the spending and it doesn't affect the growth, then it will reduce the deficit. If you don't assume growth, if you assume cutting spending cuts jobs, you are going to increase the deficit at the end, or you're certainly not going to reduce the deficit, and you're going to get in the way of the economy recovering. That's the fight we're having. Well, we should be having now, although Democrats are almost mute about